Where would you like to start?
Where could we start? I think, starting with Recursion Plaza makes sense.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Let's do.
And I can just sort of talk about, I don't know, where, like how it kind of came to be a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It was a commission for an organization in Portland called Open Signal as part of a collaboration they were doing with a marketing company called Lower Boom that was investigating the concept of post-truth. And sorry, I got distracted for a second. And so it kind of like comes about, like I started doing video game based stuff or like virtual worlds. It wasn't really like my background is just in visual art, more traditional visual art. And I kind of made this pact with myself to do like only work in forms that felt honest to me. And what that means for me is just the kind of things that sustained me growing up as a, queer trans kid in suburban Utah. And so that is kind of like the genesis of starting to work in this or doing, other projects of mine are involved like cosplay or, like perler bead sprite work or what I call like suburban occult, just sort of like magical processes.
Not to interrupt, but just to clarify, did you want to start with Recursion Plaza?
No, did I misspeak?
Okay, I think...
I really apologize.
So we're going to go back to
I'm
Ineffable.
misdirecting the video game pilot. So apologies. Ineffable Glossolalia was the one that was the commission for Open Signal. Sorry, it all becomes a muddle. And so, with that in mind about wanting to work around video games, I was sort of thinking about... having these experiences as a trans person that there's not really language for, and thinking about like, well, why is there not really language for these things? And so doing research about, historical cultural models for transness or gender queerness, came upon this Sexual Research Institute that existed in Weimar era Germany, which was the republic just before the rise of the Third Reich. So this is like, the period that's covered in like the musical Cabaret, or, there's episodes in the TV series Transparent about this German sex research institute called the Institut for Sexualwissenschaft, which was run mainly by a guy named Magnus Hirschfeld, and it was ultimately burnt by Nazi youth in 1933, where the archive was seized and burned in one of the infamous book burnings in Babelplatz Square. And so the piece, and we'll get into more specifics, I'm sure, is just kind of rumination, I guess, on how you feel the absence of an archive, like what the absence of something feels like over time. What are those reverberations? Yeah.
Would it be, do you want to go through the rooms and give us context for them, or?
Sure. Yeah, that would definitely be, that's one way to go about it.
Cool.
So we'll kind of go back to this.
I made a mistake when I started out today, and I forgot to thank Lisa Vagnani, our web director, for leading us through the games here.
Yeah.
So where are we right now?
Yeah, so you start out in this kind of conservatory space, and the aesthetics of this space and the subsequent couple of rooms are all informed by going through historical photographs of the Institute. So this is, very much like the architectural aesthetic of the space, more or less. And so this room has, an array of paintings, which certainly weren't in the Institute, but all, or at least a number of them, fall under what was termed by the Nazis as degenerate art. And so there's kind of an ongoing theme in this, just around considering degeneracy and what constitutes degeneracy, and in Nazi ideology, that's a threat to the kind of bodily health of the Volk and the people. And so that plays into what is the dehumanization of people. So here there's Max Beckmann's Departure triptych to the right there, and then the text all in this room that will come up at different times is sort of triggered on these spatial colliders that pops up depending on your proximity to a thing. Are a couple of them, the right hand two correspond to the painting themselves, and the first one is just something that had resonance with my experience about it. But the text, most of the text throughout the piece is taken from other sources. There's a little bit of it that's sort of poetic that I wrote, but it's also thinking about like, you know, how if you're in a position of, you know, your language about you either being erased in the instance of the destruction of this archive, or, you know, created through medicalization or applied to you by other people, how you're sort of forced to like make do with what other people have to say, and how you have to comprise yourself of other people's things to like find yourself in that. So you're sort of sifting through this stuff to make up a sense of self. The drawing on the bottom right was like a portrait made by a person who was being treated at this institute. So a sort of image of their ideal self. So some of the imagery is also taken from what bits and pieces remain of the archive from people who fled. Yeah.
And you just said somebody who was treated at the Institute. Can you speak a little bit more about that, or like what? I mean, yeah. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, so the Institute did a lot of different things. They're the place where there was like the first recorded sex reassignment surgeries in, at least in the West, and you know, they did a lot of research into sexually transmitted diseases and, you know, managing infections and stuff like that, you know, gynecological research. And so, you know, there's some stuff that they did on the one hand that's like very progressive. They would issue what they call transvestite pass cards, which we'll see in another room, but they would give to transgender people then so that the police wouldn't beat them up and put them in prison. So they were like legally allowed to be degenerate. But then at the same time, they are, like many of the people who are running this institute are all eugenicists, because eugenics is kind of just the order of the day, you know, whether you're a Nazi or not. It's just like, well, this is like the cutting edge science. And so kind of some of the text in this room, which has a lot of like snippets of research and stuff, are combinations of those things, of wanting to like say, okay, on the one hand, here's some progressive thoughts maybe they have. On the other hand, like, you know, they have displays and things in this institute that are just very like I don't know what to say, like perversely museological, if I can be really overblown about it, I guess, just meaning that it's like very sensationalistic displays, you know, sort of circus sideshows of like, you know, trans people or, you know, sexual deviants, you know, of weird pornography, of all of these things. And that's, you know, they're walking this line that I think partly an institute has to get people to like come in and know about their work while they can do other stuff. But yeah, there's that sort of like side-by-side darkness, I think, that's important to sit with, especially in the contrast to like Nazi stuff, because I think often, like, you know, if you look at the stories and stuff about the Institute, you know, that exists right now, it's all like, oh, this progressive Weimar Germany, this progressive institute held against the Nazis. And I think it's really important not to equivocate towards Nazism, but to say if you're going to be progressive, you need to be really thinking hard about like, what are the roots of that? What are your ethics within that? How do you rise to an occasion of being better and like challenge what is important to you, if that makes sense. Absolutely. Yeah. And
since we're still in the library kind of zone right now, I wanted to also ask about, you mentioned like the Borges Library of Babel, totally. And I don't know if this would be a good spot to bring in that invocation now, or do you feel it's better to do later or after?
No, I think it's like anything can come up wherever. It's like, it's kind of a non-linear piece, and it like conflates a lot of different things in what I hope are, you know, kind of productive poetics. So yeah, it was also partly inspired by Jorge Luis Borges' story, The Library of Babel, which is like, you know, probably most people know this story, but in a nutshell, it's, you know, this kind of like infinite library where there are books with every combination of letters. And so there are these librarians that are kind of like roving around trying to find meaning within that. And so it's that too, where, you know, like I was saying, you know, when you sort of inherit these texts that are about you, or even things that are not about you, you're trying to find a sense of yourself in them. And so there's that kind of like repetition of archive. There's also, you know, sort of plays, you know, out the window in the sort of conservatory room, there's like a burning stock image of the Tower of Babel. So there's that, where it's like the loss of language that you're trying to build towards something that's like transcendent or meaningful, but you get struck down for, I guess, flying too high and you lose language. It's also feels resonant but totally unrelated that the square where the book burnings were Babelplatz Square, but it's named for a different person. It was the founder of the Socialist Democratic Party, so different, not Nazi party, but a different socialist party in Germany at the time. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Before we continue, I have one more question about these rooms when I was playing the game.
Sure.
And this just might be an aesthetic glitch thing or whatever, but I noticed that there are parts of like the room, like full squares that kind of like light up or get dark, like on the floor or something.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious about that.
That's the fact that I don't have a very good technical background, and it just is kind of a glitchy, janky kind of thing where it just sort of, tips its hand. Like when I'm producing these things, I'm not modeling the vast majority of these objects. They're all from object libraries or sourced from, pirated games or renders, from like architectural websites and stuff like that. So it's cobbled together. It's very much like, and I think Torp says this in the thing, it's like set dressing a little bit, where it's just like bringing a lot of different things together to like comprise a sense of space.
Set dressing.
Yeah.
I never heard of this phrase, and maybe this is
okay.
Just me, but it seems to be an established thing. Is this something in theater or architectural design?
I guess I think of it in terms of theater, just like, if you were making a play about something, you wouldn't make every single chair. You wouldn't craft those chairs. You would find chairs, or if you were doing art direction for a film, maybe I should talk about it that way. Or like, Porp talks about, it's an assemblage of these things. Right.
And I guess something else Porpentine talks about in her essay, which I think is really great and well said, is she talks in the beginning about something like if the materials are radioactive, it's because it's what we had to work with, and talking about not just appropriating things which are already made, because like why not, they're there, but also taking things which are discarded. And she talks about trash a lot, and how that being like an important material to rekindle something from and find value in. Yeah. And so when you talk about like just taking things as they are and using them, I kind of find resonance in that, which is nice and meaningful for me.
Cool. Yeah. That's the radioactiveness then that you're seeing. That's why the squares don't light up, right? Yeah.
And also, one more quick question, I guess, before we continue, because I keep on having so many. Did you travel to a salvaged archive for this, or how did you access or learn about what, as you did? Yeah,
so some of the archive is preserved. If you Google, like Magnus Hirschfeld Institute, I think they have a physical location now, but it's moved a couple times, so I can't remember where it is at this point. So, at the point that the archive was seized, that the Institute was seized, Magnus Hirschfeld was on a speaking tour and ultimately lived the remaining, he died in 1935, and so in, I want to say Nice in France was where it was at the time. So he had some of that stuff with them, and some of the stuff from other people fled kind of coalesced into this mostly web archive, so you can see and read a bunch of that. Like in the library rooms, there's some black and white photographs, very, like really high contrast photographs that come from that stuff. So mostly just web-based research on that.
So not everything was burned?
No, I mean, people take photographs and they take them with them, people that had come there and then gone away to other places. So there are snippets, but yeah, I mean, there's also not really any knowing kind of what was there. And, I was looking at my notes, it's like this weird sort of known unknown, that you have this black box of stuff that this research was done, that was then set way back. A lot of medical knowledge was lost about how to do certain surgeries, or this certain progressiveness was lost. Yeah, so there are some fragments that survive, but yeah.
Incidentally, I went to another artist talk this week where somebody else was researching from this archive, and something that was mentioned, I haven't backed this up, but I'm assuming this is all right. Apparently some of these materials were saved by Nazis and prevented from being completely destroyed, so they could sell them on the black market and help further fuel their efforts.
Yeah, I mean, there was, so the students that sacked the archive were sort of overseen by there's sort of a Nazi librarian named Wolfgang Herrmann who helped them establish these like 12 theses on like what makes literature Volkish and proper and good. And so they would do a thing too. Wolfgang Herrmann oversaw this library where they would, once they seized some things, they would categorize them about like sort of what level of quarantine they could be in, but they would maintain a copy of one of everything so that they had a sort of a germ library of all this like literature. So I know about some of the material being saved for those reasons, kept in vaults and that kind of thing, but I hadn't heard about for later sale. Is interesting.
I think that's what I took away.
It wouldn't surprise me. Yeah.
Thanks for hanging out there, Lisa.
Yeah, and those are transvestite pass cards that are like littering the floor. So those are found from archives.
So we're now in like the sacked library.
Yeah.
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 So
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to prompt where we are now. What are we seeing?
Yeah. This is just sort of it gets a little more poetic at times, and this is a room that considers, I guess, medicalization, and so the poetic text that was coming up there is something that I wrote that just sort of samples and riffs on, languages around genetics and, the way these things were assessed through, pseudoscience, like, what level of gay are you depending on the way you write, and what can we discern about you through that. So this is sort of like poetic transition space. Yeah.
Forget about it. Stop worrying about it. Stop thinking about anything.
And then this is this room has some strong language in it, so if you're sensitive to that, maybe don't focus too much. But yeah, so this is more like, I guess, a reflection of, what do I want to say? Like, my upbringing in like suburban Utah spaces and encountering queerness and transness through web culture online. Where I grew up, it's sort of like queer wasn't really a thing. There's like gay scene, but it's not really the same. And the spaces that I first encountered transness were just mostly through like porn on the internet. And so again, inheriting that and thinking about like where you can find yourself in that. But at the same time, these like sort of floating text snippets come from an LGBT board on 4chan, so ostensibly other queer gay people, talking about trans people and the problems that they have with them. So trying to kind of find space for yourself amidst that like weird cacophony. And the music here, I usually work with people to do sound because I don't know anything about sound. So this is a friend of mine, Rainey Baker, who has a musical project called Destroyed for Comfort, which felt really resonant.
I noticed in this room, and it will come up a little bit later too, there's a lot of representations of characters who are partially human and maybe have horns.
Okay, yeah.
I just wanted to ask about that type of character or imagery, because it's repeated there, and there's this one another image on the side which you can see.
Dang, that's true.
Yeah,
Look
and
at that.
And then there's that little librarian that we meet later.
Yeah, I haven't thought about horns specifically, but yeah, a bunch of my work has fixation on monstrousness, and that just comes with, like, again, trying to find yourself in culture where you can, and so identifying with, monsters being set apart or having to find other ways of being or feeling hybrid, that kind of thing, comes from, like, Susan Stryker, who's a feminist theorist who has an essay called My Words to Victor Frankenstein Above the Village of Chamonix, which is sort of talking about transgender rage in the context of monstrousness and like being comprised that way. And it comes out of, a lot of like rad femme writing at the time being very disparaging towards trans people, describing them as like necrophiliacs and that kind of thing. So sort of taking that like mantle of like, okay, well, if we're, these necrophiliac people appropriating bodies and being body snatchers and like, you know, being like demons inhabiting people's bodies, which is like, I'm not embellishing. These are things that are being said. Let's just roll with that and let's just be monsters. So it hadn't really occurred to me. More like that stuff was just about like, you know, youthful fixation with monstrousness, but certainly like all adolescents identify with monsters, right? But then it's like, oh, what does that turn into, you know, as an adult when you're queer? That's a hanger. There was a hanger on the floor. Yeah, and so, you know, there's like the multiple forms of archive in this space, you know, the archive of paintings, archive of libraries. This is like the server backend archive to like the space that's, you know, in the other room. Yeah. And this is the librarian that Liz was talking about. So this sort of ceramic Minotaur, which I guess just sort of felt apt because it's a labyrinth. So having it guarded by this like, you know, fragile Minotaur felt good. And the text that comes up, it's almost like I imagine them sort of telling you this story, which is this ancient Greek or maybe Roman poet named Gaius Valerius Catullus, who wrote about, there's this mystery cult of Cybele, who is like a very minor sort of fertility goddess, but the sort of initiation process into this mystery cult involved sort of, I guess, becoming trans in a way, but, you know, cutting off your genitals to become a part of this cult. So again, like looking back into myth and folklore and that kind of thing to like see where space exists for you. And this space that we're in with the shelves, there's a sort of a mirror version of it that was at the very beginning where you're at the top of it, is a replica of in Babelplatz Square in Berlin. There's I can't remember the proper name of the monument. It has its own name, but it's they dug a hole in the ground and they made shelves within this hole that would contain the 20,000 volumes about that were burnt in Babelplatz Square. So this is like a recreation of that sort of monument that you occupy, and it has a quote from a German poet named Heinrich Heine, which is like, it was at the very beginning, but it's like where first they burn books, they will ultimately burn bodies, something like this, which is actually about Christians burning Muslim scriptures. Yeah. Yeah, and this is like, I guess in some ways, maybe like an in for tech or game people, where it's like, that's kind of a standard, that like black and pink grid is like a standard like missing texture format. So if you're like, you know, in a game and it can't find the texture file, it like plasters this like obnoxious texture on it, so you know that something's not working right.
Is it coming out of a cannon?
It's just coming out of a big tube, just a big old pipe. But I could see how it would feel like a cannon. But yeah, just like the idea of like leaking nothingness or leaking glitch felt resonant. Yeah, and then it's like, you know, continuing the kind of like glitchy brokenness of this space, it just turns into these like 404, you know, website, like can't find website textures as it kind of falls apart. And then, yeah, this is another little sort of poetic, using like language about system failure and like computer language, but playing off of like, you know, certain Nazi fascist ideas about health, you know, because they're obsessed with like health and the health of the people. Yeah, you come out into this like crystalline, you know, I grew up in Salt Lake, so this is like a model of the Salt Lake Mormon temple. And these lyrics are from a Crystal Castles song called Transgender. And I have no idea why they produced this song. I can't find any real information about it. But again, it's like, it's funny because they're writing about it, you know, as cisgender people, but they're talking about it in terms of purity again. Yeah.
And we're outside and we're in Babelplatz right now?
Yeah, so this is like, you know, from Google Maps, you can take these models, which are like super simple models, but, you know, through, photographic processes. They've applied the textures to them. So these are buildings that are around the perimeter of Babelplatz, like where the books were burned. So this is sort of like a recreation of that space. I'm not sure if I can remember the buildings exactly. Like that far one is a monument to a battle in World War I want to say. The building I think to our left is I don't know if it's Berlin University or Humboldt University, but it's a university building there. And then there's an opera building that's left still. Yeah.
It's like institutions of, I don't know, the accumulation of culture in some ways, for at least for this particular era. Is the Salt Lake Mormon temple thing just a reference, like a personal reference for you? Or, I mean, we're outside. There's been an interiority of kind of going through time and going through different contexts, different types of archives and libraries that are all fraught and all have their own sort of glitches or imperfections. When I first played this game and I came outside, I felt like there's like an emotional evocation. Like there's like this beautiful fragmented sky. Like nothing's like the glitch really comes out here.
Yeah.
And I kind of felt like, I'm free, or like I'm out, But then I'm also have this temple, and also like I'm in the site of the book burning. So I wanted to know how you were thinking about the outside, or what that meant in terms of like the narrative of this work.
Yeah, I definitely wanted it to be maybe like more of a breathing space, and a space for there to be like a little bit of beauty, and to like, push that glitchiness, that breakdown, and that breakdown can be, I guess, okay, because we're playing off of like themes of degeneracy and that kind of thing. So it's like, some of the text sort of indicates it's like degeneracy is the anti-eugenic, I think is the line that I say. So like wanting to let that be beautiful is part of it. And the Salt Lake Temple, there's not a great reason other than that's an institution that, I wasn't raised Mormon, but you can't not live in Utah and really not, like you're going to feel it. I mean, it's a real theocratic state. And so it'll weigh on you. And then, using it sort of formally with that like glassy texture on it to like smear the glitch in. Like at first you're not really sure what you're seeing in the broken skybox, but that sort of like smooths it in, making a crystal castle out of this building that looks like a castle. Yeah. I
also feel like when you came outside, you can also see inside when you couldn't see out before. And that also seemed very like you're coming from a different place of knowledge or experience when you come outside.
Yeah, and it like does a couple different things. I mean, a practical reason about why I started doing, virtual environments or games is just like you don't have to deal with the overhead of like physical installation, but it also lets you do what I call like experiential abstraction that you can't have in something else. So it's sort of like, in other stuff I've done, I use it to like a real sort of dreamy effect where like you see into a space and then suddenly you're in a space and the walls will render behind you. And so you're in a place and you can't leave it. So one place becomes another in these really like dreamy, fluid ways. So that's part of it, of wanting it to feel, dreamy, that you can like slip back into these other moments at any given time. And then just like formally, if you got all the way through and you wanted to come back to revisit a moment, it's easier than having to walk back through everything. Yeah, and then the last like main sort of site that it seems like we're already heading to is this kind of like asteroid at the center of where these like the books would have been burnt. That's it's this sort of like what's called a Windows blue screen of death, which is like when a Windows computer crashes, you get this like very specific blue screen that tells you about how your computer is broken. So again, thinking about that like destruction of knowledge, this like, corruption of an archive, that kind of thing. And this is a quote from Borges' Library of Babel that is maybe a little sort of hopeful, but really like nicely felt like it summarized a bunch of what I was thinking about, which is the library will endure. It is the universe. As for us, everything has not been written. We are not turning into phantoms. We walk the corridors, searching the shelves and rearranging them, looking for lines of meaning amid leagues of cacophony and incoherence, reading the history of the past and our future, collecting our thoughts and collecting the thoughts of others, and every so often glimpsing mirrors in which we may recognize creatures of the information.
as we went through the corridors from the inside to the outside, and we saw all these different examples of the limitations of technology or glitch, whether it's the 404, the pink and black squares, or now we have this blue screen of death meteor. I was thinking about the different ways that these things come about, whether it's human error, technological failure, or possibly even a human strategy to like invoke these things to cause breakage. Is this something that you were thinking about with any particular angle, or just like is it just being like a incidental aspect of online archive, web environments, computers?
Like glitch and breakdown, that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes out of like being seen as someone who's broken, being constantly undermined as a person, or, one's sanity being undermined all the time. It also relates to just like the mistranslations that happen, misunderstandings that happen, and like what gets lost in that gap from human to human, like what of a person's experience is comprehensible to another and what isn't, and what we do with that. Like, do we let that be, something destructive? Is that a space of malice, or is that just do we know what we don't know? Do we choose to acknowledge like what we don't know and can't maybe know between one another? That feels like a cagey answer, but
no, it's something I
have
really
a concise one. Yeah.
I really appreciate about this work is that it holds a lot of contradictory things at the same time. Like it addresses the complicated nature of the ISS. It also addresses the complicated nature of the internet. Though I guess in this work I see more of like the negative. Like you talk personally about how online environments were a source of maybe solace and escape for you at some point personally. I think we all can relate to in various ways. But also in this, we see largely like the dark side, the violent side.
Yeah.
How did you just come to that decision, I guess, to represent mostly that side in this, in terms of that type of archive representation?
Yeah, I think, the way that my work always is like how I make sense of the world. And so a lot of times it's used to process some of that darker stuff. But I think it is like also trying to, like, I can't remember your exact words, but holding multiple things in contrast and at the same time. And that's not something that happens in web spaces pretty notoriously. We're all trying to like make our best case to like take someone down or call someone out. I'm speaking in broad strokes, but it's a real thing, right? And so like, how can we produce something that acknowledges that tendency, but also wants to kind of contrast it or find nuance? But yeah, it has to first be acknowledged.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that I just was thinking a lot throughout all the different references you bring into this work. Also, in terms of like the Borges thing, there's this idea of a complete knowledge, a complete library, but it's also inaccessible, useless, and you're invoking so many great contradictory things, which lead to a very complex thing. To establish knowledge or to establish truth around something, of course, is sometimes also marking an erasure or a lack of explication, or maybe even a forced explication of something which doesn't care to be explained or categorized. So, I think we're really happy to have it as part of this show.
Well, thank you.
Question.
Yeah.
Another one. Would it be better
you.
For you at this point to open up questions about this particular work, or
That's
do you want to go?
That's actually a great idea.
Okay.
To not just go to Recursion Plaza.
Yeah. I've been hogging the questions about this work so far. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask Tabitha about Ineffable Glossolalia?
So this work existing in the gallery where a person can interact, does it exist in any other form, like online, where they would be able to interact with that, and does it change that?
Yeah, no, that's a totally great question. This work was initially commissioned to be in VR. So when it was first done, it was done as a room scale HTC Vive experience, which was interesting. VR is just in such a weird spot. It's kind of hard to develop for, and there's not like the big problem I ran into with it, which is also true in ways of just like screen-based game experiences, is the audience was so kind of spectacularized by it. They had a hard time navigating it. And so one, they couldn't experience much of it, and then just, not that many people have really still done VR, and so they really wanted to concentrate on like the technology of it and like ask a lot of questions about where did I think VR was going and like hardware questions, and it's like I really don't care about any of that. I'm not a technologist, and so the content just like totally became missing. So that's one level on which it lived. But pretty much all of my interactive stuff is free to download. They link from my website, but they're hosted on a platform called itch.io. So if you Google Tabitha Nikolai, itch.io, or just my regular website, you'll find it. And so you can download it. And a lot of times that's maybe a better experience than in a gallery. I think galleries and Apex has been really amazing for working with in that regard, but a lot of times galleries just don't know how to set it up, and again, art audiences aren't used to it, and it's hard because as a medium it just tends to benefit from like one person falling deeply into it. It's almost like cinematic in that way, that you just need to like be with it and let it wash over you, versus like being seen playing something by other people who might want to turn next, or like that kind of thing. So I think, in this piece, which is partly about, experiences of loneliness, other work that I've done that's very much about loneliness and the internet and that kind of thing, experiencing that alone in a room, in like a dark room by yourself, is probably like the premium way to do it. But I'm also trying to, I also do work, and I'm trying to figure out ways to like make it a better experience for art people in a gallery. But that was a long answer, but yeah, it's on the internet. Yeah, please.
Hi. I was really interested in the part about the internet is now our infinite library, and we anxiously sift through it. And I'm wondering, does this library, or what looks like a universe, does this grow? Is this the end of this? Or as these kind of glitches continue, will this work also change or grow? Or is this kind of,
What's this? What's like the object that we're talking about? This like Ineffable Glossolalia or the internet?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Was taken. I'm looking at the glitch, like the leaking glitch,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm just wondering, will this grow from this? Like, will there be more of these kind of ways of? I'm just wondering, is this it, or will this grow even to like a bigger universe with like different things to represent kind of what you're doing in your work?
Yeah, I think a lot of my work is informed by youth growing up playing Dungeons and Dragons. Stay with me. In that, like, and I was always the one to be like the dungeon master, the game master, the person that has to facilitate the game. You have to like be all the monsters and like think about the ecology of the world. So a lot of my work is approached from world building versus narrative. Like I don't have, like I like to write, but I don't have a background in like fiction writing where you would have like an arc. Whereas like doing world building for games and stuff, you have to leave it, in my opinion, it's best if it's left very permeable, because the story should be developed collaboratively among the individuals participating, and you're kind of creating a sandbox for them to do that within. So I don't know about Ineffable spooling off into other stuff, because it felt like a pretty concise statement and is much more rooted in history than a lot of my other stuff. But I have other projects that are, I had this project that is maybe ongoing called Dynamic Horizons Limited, which is like a corporate fiction that manifests differently. I made this like corporate training manual, which is this also like Kafkaesque D&D player's handbook resource that was kind of strange, but then also had a pop-up shop where I made like fake wearable technology that was like 3D printed and like also making fun of Portland. So it's like, I don't know. So that spools off into doing a lot of different things. But for this, I don't really know. Yeah.
You talked about you approaching it more like world building.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like do each of these little projects exist all within the same world, or is it multiple different types of world building that you're doing?
Yeah, it's multiple different types. I mean, this is really a very specific. Because the prompt that OpenSignal and Lower Boom gave me to produce this was pretty specific, and then the research was pretty specific. But there's like, I think sometimes because I'm into that world building stuff, and if you get into like Dungeons and Dragons cosmology, it's all interconnected. So I do think about ways that they connect or could interact. But no, it's usually about wanting discrete palettes of stuff to work with. I have, maybe you can probably tell, like I have a little attention problem where I like to flit from things, and that's part of why I like to do digital things, is like I can try radically different palettes and like radically different experiences without having to materially invest in that. So part of it is I want different worlds that feel different ways. You know, the corporate fiction stuff feels really different than another couple of pieces of mine, Sic Transex Gloria and Shrine Maidens of the Unseelie Court, which essentially take place in the same world, but they're very different flavors. Like one is really dry and cold, and one is really this like, you know, Pacific Northwest post-apocalyptic science fantasy with like queer elves and stuff. So those are different zones.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other final questions about this work? Cool. Let's go on, I guess, to the other one.
Yeah.
I don't know how we're doing on time.
That sounds good. I don't know either.
I'll check.
Cool. Thank you to our video game pilot.
Yeah. So this one is Recursion Plaza, which you made as part of the commission for this exhibition.
Cool. So I guess maybe one of the key things to know about Recursion Plaza is that it's procedurally generated and kind of inescapable. So procedurally generated just means that it's sort of random. Each time a certain thing transpires, it'll remake it, which is like you're in this kind of infinite dead mall space, and as you explore it, you might find like a video arcade cabinet, and when you find that, it's like playing a video of the game itself. So you can go like one layer sort of deeper into this like recursive simulation, or you can, you know, when you look out a window, you're kind of like in a mall within a mall. So you can like, there's periodic like doors that will open to the outside, and you can jump out to your death, but you just become reborn in another like sphere of this mall hell. And so it's recursive in that way, and to me, it's like, I'm trying to decide like what to segue into next. I mean, I made this during kind of a period of rather bad mental health, and so it has this resonance for me in also thinking about these like negative thought loops that I would get trapped in about ruminating on the past or relationships or like transition or place in life, and that may also have something to do with like aging. And so, you know, growing up again in Salt Lake City, which is like a really suburban place, I spent tons and tons of time in these kind of like shopping malls. My first jobs were there, first dates were there, like skipping class in malls. And so there's a certain like nostalgia for those spaces, even though like those spaces are simultaneously, you know, failing. You know, malls are dying everywhere. And so both in that like nostalgia for that space, there's like a certain comfort in it. Like I find this space like really comforting. I think some people talk about feeling claustrophobic who have played it, or I can just like play this stupid thing for hours and hours and like enjoy the new spatial arrangements that feel sort of familiar to me. There's an analogy between like that comfort, but also like there's a certain comfort in living in trauma or living in your pain sometimes, that it like can feel better. It's like poking an aching tooth or something, that it's like at least it feels familiar, at least you know it. There's maybe sometimes a feeling of like moral purity in that, of like, you know, an entitlement to your suffering that can feel good in a perverse way. So it's kind of like mechanically, I think, how it relates to some of the significance for me.
Something I wanted to ask about both of these games, and you just touched on it now in a way, is that you said you could play this for a long time. And thinking about the aspect of play, you think games are something that you play. And in both of these, neither skill nor exact choice really alters a whole lot of what you experience. If you find the video game console in this one, you can play it from that perspective, but there's no specific goal.
No.
It's a lot about meandering, observing, exploring, finding, and taking from it what you will. So I wanted to ask about how you think of these as games, and maybe why a game as opposed to some other sort of,
I would be totally down to brainstorm with you about words that aren't game. I used to be militantly it's not a game, it's a virtual world, it's an digital installation, it's something like that, and it just became so hard to communicate with people about it because the instant you say the word virtual, people are like, virtual reality, and then it's like, no, I don't want to, we can't talk about that, or it's not made for VR, so it confuses people. So I've kind of just acquiesced to game because it just gets us to a level of content discussion a bit faster. But yeah, it's definitely not, I'm not even a gamer anymore. I grew up playing tons of video games, but I haven't in a long time. It's hard for me to find time for that. Not that I totally get why people would. So I'm definitely not interested in making anything that feels too gamey. I'm just kind of wanting to, I guess, subvert the medium a little bit to do more unusual things in an art context. But yeah, it's a fair question. Why game then? And even in this one, I'm using tropes of games. There's the little heads-up display map in the top right corner, but it's broken. It doesn't work. It's just an artifact of the technology. You can walk through walls, or see there, we just walked through a wall. So thinking about how that kind of thing is misleading, which maybe also plays into some of the mental health feelings of it.
This might be not the right sort of takeaway, but when I played with both of these, I felt like the preserved elements that you kept that were kind of game-like, whether it was this red herring, as you described it to me, of the map in the corner, or hitting over those signs and getting that sort of pinball, cling, cling, or this ability to jump in both of these environments, which is kind of useless, but also kind of funny at the same time.
Okay, yeah,
they're a little humorous to me, and
yeah.
I didn't know if that was, I don't know, sort of a tongue-in-cheek way of tipping your hat to the game.
It's yeah, totally. I can totally see that. For me, it's I do try to play with a shortcoming of mine in making these things is because I don't code anything really. I can cram together snippets of other people's code, or write a little bit, but so the weak point in everything I do is interaction design then, because interaction is more heavily any more code, whereas everything else just aesthetic. It's just manipulating objects in space. So for bonking over signs, or kicking around trash bags and stuff, it's me trying to figure out what's the minimum threshold of letting people feel agency and feel immersed in the space, to be oh yes, I am a part of this space. I'm not just a disembodied spirit or something like that. But at the same time, also this space should feel somewhat understimulating. So it's yeah, okay, I can eternally kick these things around, but that's maybe not super happy. But yeah, not necessarily a nod to games, but yeah, just what is the threshold of enjoyment? Yeah.
Does anybody have any specific questions about Recursion Plaza for Tabitha?
Thank you. Thanks for bringing up the game theme, because we talk about reward, and when we think of games, we think of ascending levels and rewards, and there's a lot of nihilism in this, in that you don't get rewarded and that you don't ascend, because you're going to always be in the same shitty plane for the rest of your life. So I heard you say minimum reward, or minimum interaction, minimum impact, and the kind of, it seemed like your goal or your decisions were based around this threshold of almost pointless, but not quite. So I'm curious about that and then legibility, the Venn diagram of
not interactive and not holding interest, but holding interest in a very particular way, and then legibility. And as a Unity user, like this is legible to me in a particular way,
Okay,
right?
cool.
But
Yeah.
I can imagine folks that haven't generated things like this so I'm just curious about all of those things plus engagement.
Yeah, that's a lot of good things. Okay. Legibility is, it's interesting because I think you feel this in like talking about Ineffable, the first one, because it's like, I tend to just be a little more like maximalist. I tend to like overcode things in the sense of like so much like, oh, and this can mean this and that can mean that, and like, very colorful and maybe like hyper stimulating. So this, I wanted to make something that really like turned that down a bit. But I think, has a legibility for people that have that maybe suburban experience. I think, it takes a while for people to play it to get an awareness about the procedurally generated nature of it. But people seem intrigued when it does. And so I guess I hope on an engagement level that it's like people stick with that, and maybe it alludes to possibility more. It maybe sort of like pulls them through it. It's like, oh, maybe if I keep like sifting, maybe if I just chase this like thought pattern down far enough, something will come of it, but often it doesn't. Yeah. Does that get at least part of your question?
Yeah, I feel like there's still reward,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like if you have to learn it,
Yeah.
invest some time to be rewarded.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, it's like, I'm really keyed towards just spatial dynamics. So maybe I already said this, I apologize, but like I just love getting like new vistas and seeing new arrangements of things. And there's like a tranquility in that that's really special for me because there's no people to deal with. Like, a lot of my work feels really vacant because it just feels, I don't know, that feels like there's space to sort of breathe psychically, even if the space is really crammed with aesthetic and stuff. And it feels sometimes like people are like, oh, you should put characters, you should put more monsters, you should do that. And it's like, it feels wrong to me. Like I'm kind of chewing on this because it's like so like constant in my work, but it just feels wrong to depict people sometimes. Like it just feels like at its core so presumptuous, even like, I don't know. It's like it's not totally there yet, but it's like, yeah, I got to sit with it more. But I like vacant spaces for that reason. I just feel haunted.
Any other questions? Is there a specific project you wanted to kind of end on or discuss from, I know you had your website ready, but are you?
No, that was just kind of like as a backup in case like it became crucial in talking about Dynamic Horizons Limited or, something to be like, oh, we got another
That
thing.
too.
But,
Yeah.
No.
Very good. Any other final questions then, before we wrap this really interesting and talk full of great information?
Yeah, and I'll be around too if you want like one-on-one questions.
Right.
That's easier.
Tabitha, thank you so much.
Well, thank you
all
so much,
for
Apex
coming.
Art. Y'all have been amazing. Thank you very much.